Joining me for tonight's Conversations with the Great Minds is Ralph Nader, attorney, consumer advocate, and five-time candidate for President of the United States. In the 1960s and 1970s, Mr. Nader spearheaded the campaign to improve automobile safety standards, and in the decades since, he's lent his passionate advocacy to a variety of issues, including campaign finance reform, the anti-nuclear movement, and third-party politics. His new book, Told You So, the Big Book of Weekly Columns, is a collection of editorials and columns from the past few decades and a must-read for anyone who wants to understand one of our country's fiercest defenders of democracy. Ralph Nader, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Tom.
It's great to have you with us. You were our very first Conversations with Great Mind guest. It's great to have you back again.
Thank you.
I want to get to your book and the topics in it, but first, just kind of a reboot on Ralph Nader, and for people who, young people who might be, this might be an early exposure for them. What first got you interested in becoming this crusading lawyer, consumer rights advocate, and then ultimately into the political arena and into the larger political area?
Well, I had a lucky choice of parents, and they always defined freedom as civic responsibility, and not flag waving or letting someone else take on people's civic responsibility. But the thing that really started the auto safety was I lost a lot of friends in high school and college. In those days, it was 5-6 times more likely for a student to get killed or injured in a crash.
It's like 600%.
Yeah. Yeah, there were no seatbelts. You know, the dash panel was like a room full of knives. You'd hit it at 10 miles an hour, you could get killed. Doors would pop open. Steering columns would drive back into your. It was really quite dangerous. Brakes were not as good. Handling was haphazard. So I got interested in it, and I was hitchhiking a lot all over the country, and once in a while, the truck drivers I was with would be the first stop at a crash, and it was really a grisly scene. You know, it was before the ambulances came, and I got interested in law school and wrote a paper on unsafe automobile design and the lack of legal standards, and that led to the book on Safe at Any Speed, which led to the motor vehicle safety laws, which have saved over 1 million lives and pushed standards higher for European and Japanese cars at that time. So that's when democracy worked. You couldn't do that today.
How does it feel to be the guy who saved 1 million lives?
It feels good, and every day, you know, it happens. People, their children, themselves, you know, they get into crashes that they survive now, or they wouldn't have survived. And so we're down to about 1.4 fatalities in this country for every 100 million vehicle miles traveled. It was about 5.5 fatalities for every 100 million vehicle miles traveled in 1965.
Yeah, in fact, I remember in the late 60s, I was a teenager and visiting family up in New Michigan, and an acquaintance, a friend of my cousin's, was impaled by a steering wheel.
That's it.
In a fairly low-speed crash, but it went right through his chest.
Yeah.
And that was it. So, yeah, that's extraordinary. And that was not an unusual thing back then. So what then took you from that into politics?
Well, the press really ran with the story, and so they would ask, you know, what's next? And so we got into natural gas pipeline safety, and that led to the legislation on natural gas pipelines, and then everything began opening up. Flammable fabrics, product safety, into the environmental area, which is basically, you know, compulsory consumption of pollutants and toxics. So it was a consumer issue too.
Yeah.
And so we pushed through the Environmental Protection Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, and a whole variety of others. And then the great breakthrough was the Freedom of Information Act amendments of 1974. And that put us #1 in the world in our ability to get information from secretive government.
That's extraordinary. Now, a few minutes ago, when you were talking about the auto safety, you talked about how you were able to get legislation passed that saved 1 million lives, and then you kind of almost as a throwaway line, said you couldn't do that today.
Yeah.
I suspect that's not really a throwaway line, that there's a big story there.
No, we would have improved our country enormously if we just had a chance to have a chance of getting a hearing in Congress and in the media. What happened over the last 30 years is, number one, the Democratic Party started dialing for the same corporate dollars. Right. You could just see it from 1979 into the 80s. It all began to close down on citizen groups and labor groups and poverty groups and environmental groups. So we were lucky that in that period, 1965 to 1974, we got some fundamental legislation, the air and water pollution laws, for example. And I think some of the politicians were afraid of the people coming from the 60s, the demonstrations, the rallies. Certainly Richard Nixon was. I mean, he signed bill after bill that we got through Congress. Environmental bills, worker safety bills, consumer bills. They never believed it. But he was the last Republican president to be afraid of liberals, and he still heard the rumble from the people from the 60s. And then it all began coming down. At the same time, the corporations began enormously organizing, increasing their campaign contributions through PACs, political action committees, pummeling labor as they began exporting jobs. They weakened the labor movement, rigorously getting their own officials in high positions in government, right into the regulatory agencies themselves. And of course, the election of Reagan really cemented corporatism in Washington, D.C., which we now call corporate occupied territory. So that the civic organization didn't keep up with the corporate organization.
So the this transition period, the mid-70s.
Yeah.
I mean, this followed the famous memo that Lewis Powell wrote to his best friend, the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, saying we need to take over the schools, we need to take over the courts, we need to take, the corporations need to organize. And he actually named you in that memo. And he said these people are out to get us. To how much credit or discredit do you give to Lewis Powell? And months later, he was put on the Supreme Court by Nixon, and the court started ruling in a very, very corporate way, and that has been turned into an art form by John Roberts. How much credit do you give to that Powell memo as being perhaps the opening shot in the salvo of what became the Reagan Revolution?
That was very important. You've written about it. It's very important because what it did, it laid out a plan from a utility lawyer. He represented utilities and other big companies in Richmond, Virginia. And it also brought him to the attention of Nixon, which led him to the Supreme Court. So it was pretty important on that basis. But what he did was he told corporations they had to organize a huge public relations campaign, which I call propaganda, pay attention to the universities and to the students, because he saw the rebellion coming out of the universities, anti-Vietnam War, civil rights. And they organized, the big companies organized the business roundtable, very, very high-level lobbying effort. And then they beefed up a lot of the trade associations. But they really went to work on the mass media. I mean, they would meet with the New York Times, the top people. Abe Rosenthal was organizing in the New York Times. He was the chief editor, and he was organizing these suburban attachments to the paper, Westchester County, Long Island City. He wanted ads. And you could just see in the early 70s, the coverage of what we were doing started going just down like that. And I would be told by reporters in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, we send it up, but it doesn't get in, Ralph. And that's Abe Rosenthal. And of course, if it doesn't get into the Times, it's less likely to get into the Washington Post, and it's definitely less likely to be on the evening news. So that was a very important part of the corporate counterattack. And I think the media forgot its role, because it should have been very proud in the 60s and early 70s that they had a sense of newsworthiness that says that what citizen groups are putting forward is really important, it's documented, it can improve health, safety, economic justice, and they reported it. And of course, a lot of these bills got through Congress and were signed by Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. And you think they'd be proud of that, Tom? Instead, they started to become just a business, just an investment in their bottom line. And of course, Murdoch came in, and the General Electric owned NBC, and the concentration of radio chains, station changes, and everything became more and more concentrated. And so they silenced a great deal of the civic energy in the country, and it's still going on.
Well, and there were some milestones along the way in that. In '87, Reagan stopped the enforcement of the, well, in '82, he stopped the enforcement of the Sherman Act, leading to the M&A explosion. In '87, he stopped the FCC Fairness Doctrine, which required news to actually be news, and suddenly we had infotainment. And then in '96, Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act, which auctioned off our airwaves. Is it possible to get back a media that actually talks about the news rather than just the bright shiny things, you know, and the infotainment? Yeah, two moves can begin loosening up the oligarchy and opening it up for people's voice. One is to have enlightened billionaires run in 2016, either as independents for president or pushing the parties in the primary season. Because you got to break up the two-party tyranny, because it not only keeps away competition, but it doesn't discuss major issues. I mean, in our website, and we kept it up, the 2008 website, for purposes such as this, votenader.org, we had 18 areas that have majoritarian support and that are off the table. From the Democrat-Republican Party, like a living wage. They didn't talk about that. Single payer, full Medicare for all, free choice of doctor and hospital. They didn't talk about that. The Pentagon bloated budget, the wars in Iraq, and so on. Things that are on people's minds. Tax code changes. So there's so much off the table. So that's one. We've got to get some of these enlightened billionaires. Now, I agree, 99.5% of them are not that way, but there are some. Well, this is kind of a Ross Perot strategy that you're talking about? Yeah, only, I mean, he got almost 20% of Americans voting for him, and he was basically just saying free trade is a crock. And you got to fight fire with fire. I mean, if big money entrenches the two parties, we need substantial big money on the other side. Are there any enlightened billionaires who are willing to step forward? I'm compiling a list, and I'm going to release it in a few weeks. Oh, yeah. Wow. And in accordance with certain criteria. I'm not saying they're going to do it. I'm saying because of who they are and what they've done and how much they have in wealth and how articulate they are, that they should consider it, because the country's heading into the pits. And the other answer to your question, in terms of what can start breaking it up, is to organize, and it can start slowly, Congress watchdog groups in every congressional district. It can start with 100 people and then go to 500 and go to 1,000, and they support full-time offices, and they have like a 10-point agenda, and they connect with each other, and we're underway, because there's nothing pushing Congress anymore except a few issues like anti-pro-NRA, abortion, anti-abortion. But the major directions, military, foreign policy, corporation power, all that, jobs, economy, exporting jobs, globalization, they're not even part of the congressional scene. We can't even get Congress to act to get 30 million workers to make as much as workers made in 1968, adjusted for inflation. Right, and they're also not part of the media now.
More of tonight's Conversations with the Great Minds with Ralph Nader after this break. Welcome back to Conversations with Great Minds. I'm speaking with Ralph Nader, attorney, consumer advocate, 5-time candidate for President of the United States, and author of numerous books, the most recent being Told You So, the big book of weekly columns. Mr. Nader, welcome back. It's so good to have you with us. Told You So, the big book of weekly column. Well, there's a bigger version of it right there. Why Told You So? Because in the last 10 years, the neocons and the wrongdoers have been saying to the American people, we've got to get this policy, invade Iraq, we've got to deregulate Wall Street, we've got to continue with fossil fuels, etc. And they turn out to be wrong. Everything they said would happen as a result, just the opposite. And so they're still getting big book advances, $100,000 speeches. You know, Paul Wolfowitz, Elliott Abrams, Cheney, Rumsfeld, just out with a new book. They're getting good positions. They get invited to the White House. In the meantime, the people who were right, like Jim Hightower and Bill Grider and Bob Kuttner and others, who made the warnings and put the yellow signs up and also said we've got to go in renewable energy and we've got to push peace as a strategy and we've got to have corporations subordinated to the sovereignty of the people. They're marginalized. They can't get on Diane Rehm, or they can't get on Terry Gross. They can't certainly get on Charlie Rose. He has Tom Friedman on 80 times.
David Sanger's been on about 55 times, and he has Kissinger on. So I'm saying, you know, it's about time, and I've had these columns over 40 years, a pretty good record of predictions, and a pretty good record in terms of what we proposed, like auto safety, up against a lot of opposition, that turned out right. The same with environmental issues and other issues. So I decided, what the heck, I'm going to just say, told you so. Because there's something decaying about a political economy that rewards the people who are wrong, vicious, cruel, and self-serving, and are against the basic principles of our democracy. And they penalize or marginalize the people who are right again and again.
Yeah, excellent point. The Supreme Court recently struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. And this seemed to me, I mean, the 15th Amendment not only says that people should have the right to vote regardless of race, but Section 2 says the Congress shall have the power to make legislation to enforce this. The Voting Rights Act was that legislation. On what basis can the Supreme Court say this is unconstitutional? And
it's a new doctrine, the Roberts doctrine. Not only does he have an originalism doctrine that he exempts corporate chartering and personhood from, he now has a futurism doctrine, which means if Congress doesn't update a law, it's unconstitutional. I mean, it's ridiculous. The law, when it was enacted, was constitutional. You can't have a retroactivity. When it was enacted, it was constitutional. It was determined as such by prior Supreme Courts. So this is a bizarre doctrine that basically says, well, in our opinion, in our judicially dictated opinion, we, 5 members of the Supreme Court, say that things aren't so bad in terms of racial discrimination. Therefore, we're going to invalidate an important part of the law, gutting it, until Congress rewrites it.
Right.
I mean, this is the most judicially active gang of 5 by far in the history of the Supreme Court.
And when you combine that with just the doctrine that the court itself can overthrow laws passed by Congress, which was established by the court itself in 1803, the Marbury v. Madison case, which is not in the Constitution.
That's right.
As Scalia, oddly enough, pointed out yesterday in his bench statement, he said the Constitution does not give us the power to overthrow. He just came right out and said it. This it seems like we have moved from being a constitutionally limited representative democratic republic to being a constitutional monarchy. And these are the monarchs.
Very much so. It's executive power. Congress has abdicated the war declaration power, the appropriations power, and so on, so much. And the rest is dumped into the hands of unelected 9 justices. I mean, it's just unbelievable what's going on.
So what do we do?
We have a de facto coup d'etat that is continuing. I mean, NAFTA and WTO. I mean, what's the idea? They can bypass our constitutional processes and put the authority in a secret tribunal in Geneva, Switzerland?
Right, and for people who don't know what we're talking about, the Constitution says that the treaties have to be ratified by the Senate with a two-thirds majority.
Two-thirds majority.
And instead, they've presented these things as trade agreements, and now we don't even have the ability to litigate them. The litigation process is not in our court system.
We don't have standing. They've thrown out all Americans and they don't have standing to sue.
Right.
And they got it through with 51 votes. That's all they had to have because they renamed it a trade agreement, as you said, instead of a treaty, which all the other countries called a treaty. I mean, these kinds of maneuvers constantly. But they have one theme. They subordinate the rights of individual people to the supremacy of the corporate entity. That's the thing. We now are ruled by artificial entities called corporations. You've written a book on it. And it's that 1886 Santa Clara decision, which wasn't really a decision. It was faked in the head notes, as you documented. And that's the final devastation of citizens. I mean, imagine if we were ruled by robots and they were given personhood status. No, people wouldn't stand for it. So here we are. We're subordinated to the supremacy of corporations, and it affects us and the rest of the world until we reverse it. And we subordinate and make corporations our servants constitutionally, not our masters. And by the way, as you know, Corporation isn't even in the Constitution.
Yes.
Company isn't even in the Constitution. You have people like Scalia and Roberts of the Supreme Court, pontificating about the corporation's right of free speech, a right to fund candidates without limit. I mean, I kid anthropologists. I said, come back from the tribes in New Guinea. They talk about animism and totems and, inanimate trees and stones be given spice. We're the leading animists in the world in terms of what we invested in corporate personhood.
Yeah, we are worshiping an artificial, a non-existent form. What's your solution?
Solution is to strip corporations of their personhood so that we can subordinate them and elevate to the primary status the individual. Because the corporations, the rights under the Constitution are to people, real people, not artificial entities. We're not talking about employees of corporations. They have all equal rights. But the entity itself should not be allowed to lobby. So General Electric or GM or Merck, they could not lobby. They cannot contribute as corporations under Citizens United, for example, to political campaigns, and they can't engage in testimony of any kind. Their employees can, but the corporate entity cannot. That's the beginning of what I call the movement of subordinating the corporate entity to the supremacy of citizen sovereignty.
Now, given that what you're describing here is in the face of not any legislation, no legislature has ever said corporations should be people or money should be speech. No president has ever said corporations should be people or money should be speech. Mitt Romney tried to, but he wasn't president. But the Supreme Court has been saying this for over 100 years. So isn't it going to require an amendment to the Constitution to do what you're talking about?
Yes. It would be nice to get a statute through and see how the Supreme Court handles it. It's going to take it, and it's the major amendment of our time, because the Constitution has been overthrown by institutions that aren't even mentioned in the Constitution. By the way, political parties aren't mentioned in the Constitution. Corporations or companies are not mentioned in the Constitution. Why are they ruling us? Right. I mean, it's a mockery of these conservative Supreme Court justices who say they believe in originalism.
Right.
Well, go back to originalism, and you wouldn't have written the opinion in Citizens United.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we've been watching this Edward Snowden saga, the whole NSA spying thing, and it raises the question, how did we become the country that people flee from when engaging in dialogues with the press? We used to be the country that people fled to.
Well, basically in the Snowden and many other whistleblowers of late from NSA and CIA, people like Tom Drake and John Siriaco, these are blowing the whistle on crimes. Crimes, for example, of snooping without warrants, dragnet on millions of Americans, email and telephone, crimes of incarceration of people without charges, crimes of torture, crimes of wars that haven't been declared, killing and injuring millions of people, corporate contracting crimes, corporate crime and contracts in Iraq and elsewhere. And who's on the run? It's not the criminals. It's not the wrongdoers. They're pursuing the right doers, the truth sayers. So that's when you know that we've lost it in terms of any kind of balance in our country, that we've reached a tipping point and beyond in terms of where our constitutional system has been subordinated to institutional violations and crimes.
So, I mean, tipping points are really dangerous things, because once you pass them, it's really hard to come back.
Very hard,
you almost have to reset the system all over again.
That's right.
The tipping point of the extinction that wiped out all life 250 million years ago led to the rise of the dinosaurs. And the tipping point at the end of the, I mean, we don't have dinosaurs anymore. So how do we do that?
It all starts with Congress, because Congress is the most important branch, most powerful branch in government, the tax power, the war power, the oversight investigation power, the appropriations power. And fortunately, it happens to be the most personalized and smallest, 535 men and women, and they represent millions and tens of millions of voters who are not organized. So once the organization starts back home, then the prospect of losing votes becomes more important to the senators and representatives than the prospect of losing campaign money. And that's what we have to get underway. And we're starting organizing now on the minimum wage upgrade to reach 1968.
Oh, yeah, the time, we have just a minute left. I'm sorry, the Time for a Raise campaign. I want to get to that.
It's timeforaraise.org. It starts very low. Let's catch up with 1968, which would take the federal minimum wage from $7.25 now to $10.50, right, which would be 1968 adjusted for inflation. I mean, look how absurd. We're lowest minimum wage in the Western world. And Canada is 10 1/4.
And using that as an organizing principle, just as
yeah, exactly. Australia is almost $16.
Their minimum wage.
Yeah, and they have a lower unemployment rate than we do, plus full health insurance. I mean, we're going backwards in the future. We are an advanced third world country.
Amazing.
Advanced militarily, science, technology, but in the livelihood of the people, we've got to turn it around.
Agreed. Ralph Nader, thanks so much for being with us tonight.